You've found the Backup Wrap Up, your go-to podcast for all things backup, recovery, and cyber recovery. In this episode, we talk about detecting ransomware. With cyber threats evolving at a breakneck speed, understanding how to spot the early signs of a ransomware attack is more crucial than ever. We're once again joined by cybersecurity expert Dr. Mike Saylor, who shares invaluable insights on the subtle indicators of ransomware activity, from performance degradation to unusual network behavior. We'll explore the role of SIM and XDR tools in early detection and discuss why a rapid response is your best defense against these malicious attacks. By the way, if you have no idea who I am, welcome to the podcast. I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and I've been specializing in backup and recovery all the way back to 30 years ago when I could not restore a database because our backups were broken. I hated having to tell that to my boss, and I don't want you to have to tell that to your boss, so that's why I do this. On this podcast, we turn unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap Up. Welcome to the show. If I could ask you to take a quick second to press that subscribe or follow button so that you can always get our content, that would be great. I am W. Curtis Preston, otherwise known as Mr. Backup, and I have with me a guy who almost lost his head today, Prasanna Malayandi. How's it going, Prasanna? We're glad that you're alive.
Yeah, I escaped without losing any fingers or my head, so it's a good day, I'll take that any time of the day.
So why don't you tell the listeners why we had to delay this recording? What happened to you?
So I was walking by and getting tea before the podcast, and I was like, oh, and I looked up at the ceiling, and we have in our kitchen, we have a ceiling fan. And I was like, that's weird. What's that blue piece? And why does it look a little tilted? So luckily I got a chair or a step stool, and I was like, let me take a closer look. And I literally touched it, and then the thing fell down and was just dangling by the 3 wires, right? The ground, the hot, and and I was like, and then I had to quickly call my wife, and it's very awkward. These are 30 pounds, right? And it's hanging above you. And I was on a short step stool, and I was like, how do I actually unclip these wires? And it was a whole fiasco with ladders and step stools and all sorts of things in order to be able to do it. But I have it down, which is good.
Yeah. And an anxious wife hanging over to the side.
Yes.
Do you think you're going to be replacing the fan? With a new fan, or just reinstalling?
It's gone. I'm going to just put a normal light, because honestly, we've lived here for 11 years now, 10 years, something like that. And I think we've only used that fan once.
Yeah. It's funny, it's funny, I recently replaced my ceiling fan in the kitchen with just a light. And what I remember was when I wanted to take it off, I just could not figure out how to get it out, what I was supposed to do to get it out of there properly. And I wish that it was just hanging by the 3 wires. I just remember that a Sawzall was involved at one point.
Yeah. Well, and the hard part with that is it's bulky, and then I saw the fan blades attached. And you can't see anything, right? Because they hide all the things, and it's okay, how do I pop off this trim piece so then I can get to the screws to unscrew it? But like you said, luckily, because my outlet box had basically detached itself from its support, it was just kind of hanging there. And so it made work a little easier. Because if it was still attached, I don't think I could have figured that out.
I'm glad that you survived, and I'm glad that for once it's one of the stories from your house rather than stories from my house that we're featuring on the episode. So speaking of stories, we once again have Dr. Mike Saylor with us, our at this point resident cyber expert. How's it going, Mike?
That's going well, guys. How are y'all?
Well, we're alive. But this week, I wanted to jump right into this idea of ransomware detection, right? So we tell people that they should assume breach, right? That they should assume they're going to be attacked, and because statistically speaking, they probably will be. And you've dealt with a lot of these attacks, so I want to understand, what does a ransomware attack look like, right? Like, what are the things that people see that are going on that don't, like, if you get a big thing on your screen that says, hey, you give us $1 million, we're going to get your files back. That's one way to know you have a ransomware attack. But what other things happen before that tell you that you have a ransomware attack? Is it a ceiling fan? If a ceiling fan starts to fall, is that?
Well, and I think before Mike, before you jump into that, Curtis, maybe it might be a good idea, just because I think listeners may not be listening to every episode in order. It might be a good idea to say like why Mike is on the podcast and why he's the expert in this area, right? Especially when talking about ransomware detection. Or Mike, maybe you want to cover that.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Certainly. So happy to comment on all of those things. I think my experience over the last probably at least 20 years responding to incidents, both at personal at the personal level, whether it's a family member or somebody referred someone to us to help with a problem, or a corporate level, and that's school districts, banks, normal business enterprise that have incurred some cyber incident. We've seen quite a bit of variety of incidents, especially around ransomware. There's hundreds of different variants of ransomware. There's the more popular ones that we've probably seen more often than the others, and there are some consistent themes and potholes and lessons learned, and when someone that's seen it before shows up to help put out the fire, we know where to put the water first, what not to put water on, when to ask for help, and who else to involve in that. So
Mike, instead of go ahead, finish.
Happy to share my experience and some stories.
Yeah. So unlike me, who's a YouTube person, you're actually like grounds on the boots, someone who's actually lived and does this on a like day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. And you said grounds on the boots, and the first thing
boots on the ground.
Boots on the ground, yeah.
And first thing I thought of is that needs to be a T-shirt at a coffee shop. I think that would because I'm an avid coffee person, so that made sense to me, even though you said it that way. But absolutely, I'm in addition to being hands-on, years ago in rebuilding machines and actually, typing in commands and running tools. Today, I'm more of what they consider a breach coach. So you've had an incident, and I'm just there to try and herd the cats and give updates in a politically correct and less stressful manner. Be the one there that's already had my hair burned off while everybody else is running around on fire.
Mike, during the pre-call, you had mentioned how different, how different ransomware is from other malware, and I think that's probably a good place to start before we talk about what an attack actually looks like.
Sure. Well, malware in general, just bad software. It's intended to do nefarious things or trick us or steal from us. And there are elements of malware that are consistent across different types of malware. It's like info stealer malware, harvesting malware that captures your keystrokes or looks for certain things. There's malware that just does reconnaissance, and so when you think of really bad malware, it has the worst of all these elements combined. And the more effective ransomware these days really does perform in different phases. So the first phase is it wants to gain access to whatever it's infected. So that computer, your smartphone, that server, whatever it might be. And then it wants to figure out, well, what do I have access to? And so was it a particular user account that allowed it to infect this device? What does this device then and that user profile have access to across a network? What type of software or files are on this machine? For example, there is a specific ransomware that only targets point of sale systems. And so if it infects my laptop, it's going to determine whether my laptop is a point of sale system. And if it is not, it's going to look for a way to spread to the next system. And once it does, it will clean itself off of my laptop. So as if it were never there. And then it will continue doing so until it finds a point of sale system. And then it will deploy its ransomware, whatever additional software and capabilities it has. But there's those first few phases of what do I have access to, and what can I, what value aligned with my ransomware campaign does that bring me? That then triggers a whole slew of other things like, okay, so I found a point of sale system. Do I still have internet access? And if I do, I'm going to reach out and download the next piece of malware I need specific to the point of sale system I found. And so a lot of times that initial malware ransomware infection is a very, what we call a thin or light payload. It's not very large. It doesn't draw a lot of attention. It doesn't do a whole lot other than determine whether it has access to whatever this ransomware actor is interested in. And then it'll phone home and say, hey, I've got the goods. Send the next payload and we'll get started.
For that first phase, I know we're talking about ransomware detection. Is there anything you could really do to detect? I know you said it's a very lightweight, thin shim, right, that gets installed, deployed. Are there things people can do to detect at that phase?
There are, and there are some symptoms. These first few phases are different from one ransomware variant to, or even just malware in general, from one variant to another. But they do consume resources, and to do reconnaissance, to do a system inventory. There will be a change in resource utilization. CPU may go up, memory may go up, drive I/O may go up, network I/O may go up. And so if you have the ability to monitor those things, and it may not be much, but set some thresholds that say, if my system resources go above whatever it is, let me know. And that may be because you're watching a movie, but at least it's because you're watching a movie. Versus I'm typing, a new chapter to my book, and then all of a sudden my CPU spikes. Well, I'm not doing anything that would justify that. So let me go look at what processors are running and so on. Well, for the normal person, or even the normal technical person, I could go look at Windows processes and not know what 95% of those are. But I could potentially kill that process, and then maybe dig into what spawned that process? Where's that file, and what folder is it in? And what's the time and date stamp that happened? And was that something I did? So there's some things you can do investigatively, and it's probably a learning process as you do it. But then there are other tools like that's kind of what Blackswan Cybersecurity does. We monitor environments, and in our monitoring, we create a behavioral baseline by user, by device, by network segment. And as weird stuff happens, it flags to us because it's simply deviated from normal behavior before it becomes a security problem. So then we can call the client or the tech support person or whoever it is and say, let's dig into this and figure out if this is legitimate activity, or what can we tie it to from a user. Maybe some user clicked on a link or downloaded a file, and that's what led up to this. And so there are tools out there, and it ranges from, put your toolbox together and run script 1 and look at, report B and tie all that stuff together, which is kind of time consuming, but no cost, to more of the elaborate capabilities of hiring a managed service to really watch over all that stuff.
And hang on, I'm not sure where I wanted to go from there. Never mind. I'll
well back to the kind of the attack progression, and this lines up with the MITRE attack framework. Reconnaissance is always first, and then how do we maintain our access, because that's second part. Once I've infected you, I want to make sure that if you've determined I've infected you and you try to clean me off, I'm still infecting you. So once you reboot, I'm still there, and I'm going to be there until you throw this computer out the window. And so persistence is next, and then some of the other phases. And as that attack progresses through the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and it's all mapped out regardless of the attack, who's doing the attack, it falls into these categories, these phases. And as that phase progresses, resource and network and symptomatic identifiers will always increase. So the more activity, the further along that attack framework they get, the more identifiable it is. And so,
hey, Mike, you threw out the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Not everybody is going to be familiar with that. You want to talk about that?
So MITRE, which is an organization, developed a framework within which, and there's like 7 phases, within which every attack sequence can be mapped. And so almost every attack starts with reconnaissance. What did they gain access to, all the way through like data exfiltration. So they've got access to your stuff and they're stealing it. And so the attack framework is simply a way of identifying not only where an attack is, but how far did it go, and based on those attributes, then how big of a problem did we just incur? How big of an issue is this? But it also then allows you to align your response to those different phases of the framework. So in reconnaissance, what's my response? Well, it's maybe just passive for now. What is doing this reconnaissance? Is it normal, like internet pings just to see if a website's alive? That could be reconnaissance. Or is it something a lot more active, where they're doing port scans and some active enumeration? I pinged this IP, and I've determined these ports are open and they're responding a certain way. So now I know it's a Windows 7 or Windows 2018 server running, whichever patch level. And so that's active reconnaissance, and that's a no-no. So what's doing that, and can we address it now versus waiting until that attack progresses into one of the other phases, which could get a little more complicated as far as responding to it. But then you would have kind of your playbook lined up with what phase of the framework, what phase of the attack are we in, and here are the tools and things we should be applying at this point. And some of those are management decisions, like cut the hardware, it's that bad. But you would want all that stuff kind of mapped out and planned out ahead of time. And that's kind of, I think we touch on that in a different episode, and being prepared for game day and having your team on the same page and knowing what to do when certain things happen.
Do you ever see, like, this is fascinating to me, by the way. I haven't dealt a lot into the security side, so it's kind of cool. And it reminds me a lot of TV shows to some extent. The question I had, though, is I know that you could try to stop an attack early on, like you said, right? If you detect it early on, you could probably stop it before harm comes. But at the same time, if you don't know what they're after, isn't that also kind of a downside? Because they might figure out a different attack vector to come back at you through, right? So is that some of the risk trade-offs that happens at like a business level that the business sort of needs to make that decision?
Absolutely. And so there's value in exactly what you said. If I had 1,000 things to protect and I only had $1,000 to protect them, then without knowing the value of all that stuff and what I really need to protect, then I'm going to give $1 of a protection to all 1,000 things. But if business says out of these 1,000 things, 10 of them are the most critical for us to maintain business operations and continue making money and make sure the lights are on tomorrow, then I'm going to reallocate proportionately that $1,000 of security funding to protect primarily these 10 things, and then some, maybe a diluted version of, decent cyber hygiene to the other, 990, because they are layers between bad guys in the outside world and these 10 things that we care about. So we need some tools and capabilities on those other 990 things, but I'm going to focus most of my resources on the jewels, if you will.
Yeah.
And that's just part of what we would consider a business impact analysis. Where's the critical stuff? Well, the other part of that analysis would be, what is the financial impact? What is the business and operational impact if these things are infected or compromised or unavailable? Is that $1,000 an hour? Is it $1 million a day? How fast do I have to get things back up and running? Because, let's say we lose those 10 things to ransomware, and the bad guys want $7 million to help you recover that. Well, the business could go, all right, so they want 7 million. We've got 5 million in insurance. Insurance says they'll cover it, so we're out 2 million. And if we don't recover this within a week, we're out 10 million, because that's how much money we're going to lose. But then the IT guys and all of our subject matter experts are telling me that we can rebuild this whole thing for 10 million or maybe 9 million. So do we do it on our own and invest in XYZ? Do we pay the bad guys who, there's no guarantee there either? Or do we just suffer through it for a week and we're out X dollars while we try to rebuild it and recover on our own? So that's the business side of ransomware and some of these cyber breaches that IT and subject matter experts like we're just giving business intelligence for them to then make the decision. Paying the ransom should never be an IT decision. The IT guy, the CIO, we're not the one going, pay the ransom. We're giving the business, the executive team, the information they need to make that decision.
Sorry, Curtis, I think we went off on a tangent, but
that's all right. That's all right. So let me get sort of what I think would be an interesting part of this episode. I'm not saying this wasn't interesting, but a fascinating part is you've seen a bunch of attacks. What are some of the weird things that were going on that ultimately ended up being ransomware attacks, right? It's like they see this weird thing going on, and then eventually what they figured out was, it's because we have ransomware.
Yeah. Because always what I hear, sorry, Mike, before you continue, always what I hear is all of a sudden I couldn't access files because they were all encrypted or things like that, which is way, I'm guessing, further downstream, right? And I'm sure you have a lot of interesting stories about, hey, this, or this.
You're right. It's usually never a phone call with someone saying, I was in the middle of doing X, Y, and Z, and all of a sudden things changed. It's rarely ever that. And bad guys know this. So if bad guys tip their hand when people are at the console, the response to that is going to be pretty immediate. Right. They don't want that. They want your response to be delayed to some degree, hours, days, but they also want to be conscious and even considerate in some cases to making sure that you can, to some degree, have the ability to recover with minimal impact, because they want to be your friend. They want, hey, I did this on a Friday, so you've got the weekend to recover. And so if by Monday you decide to pay the ransom, everything's fine. Right? So ransomware attacks usually trigger Thursday, Friday.
Yeah.
And it's usually not in the middle of the day. It's usually first thing in the morning or in the middle of the night. So it's when you come to work and you notice your computer is useless. It's when the middle of the night, your batch processes, your batch jobs fail. And they know that a lot of organizations, I'll just check on it in the morning when I get there. Right? And so they've had hours to plan and deploy their ransomware to do as much damage as they can. So there's that part. And then Curtis asked about some of the things that we've seen. We've seen quite a few different interesting things. And one of the things I'll touch on too is initially you asked, how do we notice these things? How do we know if we have ransomware? Well, you will notice a small degradation in performance. If you are watching a movie, as an example, if you're streaming something, you might see some glitches. And you're like, that's weird. I've got fiber to my house. Why is it glitching? Well, it's not the internet. It's the resources on your computer being consumed by other stuff. So there's some symptomatic stuff that's observable. Well, then on the network behavior side, especially if you're a public sector entity like a school district, there are information sharing and analysis centers called ISACs. There's a multi-state ISAC. There's the state of Texas has its own called DIR. If you're in a specific sector like financial sector, there's a finance ISAC. There's one for healthcare, credit unions, auto dealerships, and they all monitor the organizations that belong to their ISAC. And so in the state of Texas, as an example, they might call a school district and say, hey, we are seeing ransomware related traffic coming out of your network. You need to address that. Just a heads up. Well, and that's pretty common. The majority of notifications to the help desk about something weird going on is usually made by a third party. It's just the way it is. We're so focused on operations and keeping the lights on and the fires out that very rarely do we see these weird things. And so those third parties, whether it's law enforcement or an ISAC or a customer or somebody working from home, it's usually somebody else notifying us that weird things are happening. And so as ransomware progresses, and there's different, and we touched on this initially too, there's different types of ransomware attacks. There's the type that attacks just you as a user, whether you're, grandma at home or you're just working from home and you've got this hybrid workstation where it's business and some personal stuff, or just business, but we're working from home as an individual. And so we get infected outside of the normal organizational network, the corporate network. We're working off of a Wi-Fi at the library or a coffee shop or at home. And so we don't have the same network perimeter protections that we might have at work. Well, those attacks focus primarily just on this laptop, this endpoint. And it's kind of a one-dimensional attack. You're not connected to anything else. It's just going to do what it does here. And hopefully there's something valuable that you're willing to pay a ransom for. Well, then the attacks at work on the corporate network, the organizational network, are a bit different in that the bad guys want to do enough reconnaissance first to see what they have access to and then make that ransomware, that infection, as broad as possible all at the same time. So in most cases, they will compromise an account, try to elevate to an admin or equivalent account, power user, find your domain controllers, and then script a deployment package to put malware on all your computers, all your endpoints, all at the same time with a trigger to start infecting and encrypting all at the same time. And so we had one, it was a pretty large company headquartered in Dallas that has projects all over the country, $1 million projects, multi-million-dollar projects. And they infected 2,800 machines all at the same time within 4 hours. Friday morning, they get kicked off at 4 a.m. And so by the time people came to the corporate office, 2,800 machines, 80% of their environment was encrypted in 4 hours.
And they didn't notice anything before that? The 2,800 machines were encrypted?
Nope. And even though this is a pretty large environment, they only had 3 or 4 full-time IT staff. They had an executive IT. I'm not sure if he was a CIO or director or what his title was. But in this particular case, and then, kind of working backwards, you get the phone call, we need help. You show up, you assess the current situation, and then you work backwards to how did this happen? And we're starting to piece together, that was the domain controller, there was a script, there was all this stuff. Well, how did they get to the domain controller? Well, they used this account. Well, how'd they get that account? And so you're working backwards to patient zero. And it was actually the backup administrator
Or backup Bob,
who had worked at this company forever and never taken a vacation. And some 3 or 4 months ago, while he was looking for vacation stuff, got infected, and they had access to his account for months while also watching him plan his vacation, which then they lined up their attack with. So he left for vacation Wednesday night, and they conducted this attack Friday morning. And so we actually were considering him as a suspect as part of this ransomware. We started seeing several years ago that threat actors have been propositioning internal privileged users to help them deploy their ransomware in exchange for a percentage of the monies paid. But in this particular case, they had access through a network vulnerability several months prior, additional access through the backup administrator account. And then in this case, the business decided to pay the ransom because these large multi-million-dollar projects were at stake, and they wanted to make sure that they got their data back and could continue working on these things. So they paid the ransom on a Monday, and the very next day, the threat actors messaged them back and said, for another $80,000, we promise to leave you alone. And it was because they had I talked about persistence. Well, they knew that we were going to clean all the ransomware off, but they had also configured 2 dormant backdoors that would have allowed them to regain access to the network at a future date. Well, we had found those over the weekend and made sure everything was clean and tight. No ability to get back in. So we told them, we told them not to pay the ransom to begin with, but they did it anyway. And then the next day when they said, if you pay some more money, we will promise to leave you alone. We told them that we took care of all that and they didn't need to do it.
So a question that I have, Mike, is with all of these things, especially during this reconnaissance phase, surely a good SIM tool can see this stuff going on, right? And can detect it. Surely that's the case. Tell me I'm and I know that nobody installs them, right? I understand that it's an expense for that a lot of companies don't install them and
or configure them.
But my question is, what's that?
Or configure them
properly, right? Yeah. Or they've configured them because they got too many false positives and they
and you're right.
It, right?
You're right. But I think there's a misconception there that these tools are too expensive. They used to be very expensive. And really, it's the labor that's the most expensive part. And that's why working with a managed security service provider is a much better approach, because you're not paying one-for-one labor. You're paying a disproportionate amount of labor because their labor is spread across all their clients. And so SIM products back in the day, for sure. And there's still open source SIM products, but to you guys' point, you've got to configure those. Well, then if you're not in the SIM, if you're not experienced in how to configure a SIM, then you could be missing the point there too. You could be missing a lot. So back to the experience and expertise of an MSSP to do all that for you. So I think there's a misconception about price. It's very affordable today, more affordable than it ever has been. And whether the client wants to own the license or not, that's a different conversation. But to your point, yes, new next-gen security incident and event management tools, SIMs, are capable of identifying weird stuff. And so our SIM, as an example, it's UEBA, User and Event Behavior Analytics. So it uses machine learning to develop a behavioral baseline by user, by asset, by network, by location. And so, for example, if Curtis does something 10 times a day, or his machine does, and tomorrow it does 10 or 1,000, that'll get flagged as a behavioral anomaly before whatever that activity is evolves into a security incident. So if you got ransomware and that new file, or even a file that maybe it looks like it's something that's been resident on your machine forever, but it starts doing something that your machine isn't normally doing, we'll see a flag for that. And in our experience, we'll also be able to determine, well, is that behavior consistent with symptoms of ransomware or some other type of malware? And then we can get on the phone and talk about, well, what did you just do, or what have you done? On that note, too, I mentioned how organizations are typically how they identify ransomware or malware. One of them is you get a call at the help desk today that a user says, hey, about 2 weeks ago, it just kind of occurred to me. It's really been bothering me. But about 2 weeks ago, I did this thing. And, it's really been bothering me. So I just thought I'd tell you now. That happens quite a bit too. And so when you start looking at that user's machine and their email, and yep, sure enough, you clicked on ransomware and it's somewhere in this environment now. So now we got to go track it down. But yeah, there's any number of things. And a SIM tool too, you can populate with, for example, if Mike got ransomware and we can determine the type of ransomware it is, we can then go do research on the characteristics of that ransomware. I can now put that in the SIM tool, and it can look across your entire environment for other occurrences of those things to try and get ahead of the next infection. But really, SIM is just part of the solution. You also have to have a good endpoint protection, anti-malware, and those two things need to play well together. So the SIM can identify the weird stuff, but then it has to be capable of telling the anti-malware on the computer what to quarantine and clean and do all this automatically, because I've been preaching this forever. Response is the most important thing. You're going to get attacked. You're going to get infected. It's going to happen. The only thing that's going to save you, or at least mitigate the impact, is how fast you can identify it and respond to it.
Is it
and so making sure that your tech stack really plays well together so that your response is as effective as it can be.
Is it too soon to bring up the C company? The company whose name starts with a C?
CrowdStrike?
Yeah.
It's not.
Too soon.
It's not. So
I will say, we don't have much time left, but if we can cover them quickly, I suppose.
So CrowdStrike's a great endpoint protection tool, and it has some really good capabilities as far as interacting with SIMs, as an example, where the SIM says weird stuff. Hey, CrowdStrike, go do this thing, clean that machine. But I think it's also an interesting time to add that those endpoint that anti-malware stuff, that system, that software that's running on your system, it's collecting all this contextual data that's then feeding up to a SIM. And it's the ability of that software on the endpoint, that CrowdStrike, as an example, it's the ability of CrowdStrike to collect this good contextual data that's then going to allow the SIM to build a good baseline and really quickly determine where the deviations from normal are. And in a lot of cases, the SIM is going to detect that behavioral anomaly before CrowdStrike will, because CrowdStrike is still is very rules based. When this and this and this and this happen, that's a security problem. CrowdStrike does really good at addressing security problems. CrowdStrike does not currently do really good at saying, hey, that's never happened before, or that's happening a heck of a lot more often than it used to. That's what the SIM does. But then the SIM and CrowdStrike, as in this case, have to play really well together. So when the SIM says, that's weird, hey, CrowdStrike, put a pause on that, put a pin in that, put it in quarantine, put it in timeout until we figure out what's going on. And we see that a lot in organizations, especially IT, where we're rolling out updates or installing new software, or third-party things like your financial system or your dealer management software needs to update something. The SIM is going to go, no, that's weird. And you're going to hear it from IT or the end user going, hey, my install paused, or it didn't work, or whatever. And well, that's good. It's working the way it should.
Protecting it. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it would have been nice if a SIM tool had said, hey, that file you just pushed out is 0 length. You might want to take a look at that.
Right. Well, that's a whole other story, a whole other ball of wax. But in particular, in this case, it was an involuntary patch. You didn't have a choice of not installing it,
Yeah.
and then it messed things up. But if you had a good incident response plan with a playbook that says when these certain types of things happen, and they can be categoric things like my machine stopped working, I've got this blue screen of death, I don't know what to do with it. Well, there's a playbook for that.
Throw it out the window.
We've
So
thought
if
through
you're
this
not-
already, and here's who to call, and
Yeah.
here's where the extra machines are, or the images that we need to re-image machines with, or whatever the case was. We've thought through this, and here's our playbook for it, and that needs to be part of your incident response plan.
So basically not Delta Airlines, apparently.
Oh, Curtis.
But
anyway,
to the backup
by
guys'
the way,
credit,
somebody,
to the
Yeah,
backup
what was that?
guys' credit, having a good virtual environment with your snapshots and all those things, that really
Yeah.
saved the other airlines. They were
Yeah.
able to, or in some cases, some of the airlines had different operating system environments and all that too. But the virtual environments, they were able to redeploy snapshots. Really,
it was
helped.
funny. I last week I flew to Atlanta for the company that I work for, and for the first time, no one asked me, "Why didn't you fly Delta?" Anyway, well, listen, we got to finish up here. So what I'm hearing from you is, it does sound like a good SIM tool is SIM tool versus XDR tool. Just a quick thought there.
So SIM,
because I know there's both.
So SIM is a little limited in its traditional ability. Its traditional ability to ingest data. So and SIM tools typically don't have that automated response. They call it SOAR, the orchestration of automated response. So SIM tools, that's usually a bolt-on, a third party or extra. But SIM also does just traditional syslog and firewall log, that kind of thing. OpenXDR or XDR, OpenXDR is better because it's primarily it's more of an open source approach. But XDR is that extra. Well, now I can ingest cloud and third party tools and IoT devices and OT devices, SCADA, smart stuff. So it's the evolution of SIM, not just in its ability, but it's also its scope. So in cyber data ingestion, we talk about north, south, east, and west traffic. So north and south is in and out of your environment, and east and west is within your environment. And as a lot of environments start to migrate either totally to the cloud or some hybrid on-premise cloud architecture, it's really important to have a platform that's capable of expanding with you, both in scope and capability. And so our platform is actually an open XDR platform. It connects to just about anything that has a data feed.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you again, Mike, for joining us.
As always, anytime. Happy to be here.
And Prasanna, I am still glad to see you alive and not decapitated or
electrocuted.
You were going to make fun of me too. I know that. You're like, excuses.
Because again, normally this is me, not you, that's doing the stupid stuff. Why am I seeing the outlet box for my thing? At least, did you install this fan?
Nope.
Okay, well, you guys, because that would be me. I'm the one who installed the fan improperly 20 years ago, and then the fan is coming down. And as I look at the air conditioner that I've installed up over there. All right. Well, thanks again to our listeners. We would be nothing without you. That is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.